So this afternoon, our graduate student session is on interiority and affect. And our first presenter is John Steichen. John Steichen grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. He moved to Boston in 2011, where he attended Boston College for his bachelor's and master's degrees, both of which were in philosophy. After completing his master's in 2017, John spent 2 years teaching middle school and high school theology at Catholic Memorial School in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. In 2019, he returned to Boston College to begin his PhD in systematic theology. His interests include Lonergan studies, mysticism, the relationship between philosophy and theology, phenomenology, and contemporary systematic theology. Today, John's paper is Towards a Lonerganian Notion of Mystical Consciousness. John.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you to everyone who helped organize this conference. I can only imagine that it was somewhat difficult to do so all online. So thank you very much. And then also thank you to everyone who's here. I can actually only see 4 people's faces, but those of you I can see, and those of you I can see, thank you for being here. Today my paper is on Lonergan and mystical consciousness, and because I'm not 100% sure of what exactly mystical consciousness would mean, there's that fun word towards at the front of the title. So here we go. In an article titled Lonergan's Unified Theory of Consciousness, Mark Morelli suggests that the doctrine of the polymorphism of human consciousness is Lonergan's greatest contribution to the history of thought. Morelli suggests this because the polymorphism of consciousness is the larger context within which Lonergan's accounts of judgment, cognitional structure, and transcendental method are best understood. Moreover, the polymorphism of consciousness as the wider context in which Lonergan's other contributions can be best understood grounds a unified theory of human consciousness. To begin to grasp what Lonergan means by the polymorphism of human consciousness, one must understand what he means by levels of consciousness, as well as what he means by patterns of experience. The levels we will come to later. Patterns of experience are the various ways that the variable range of human orientations and interests pattern the invariable core of human consciousness. Lonergan's list of such patterns includes the biological, practical, aesthetic, artistic, intellectual, dramatic, and mystical patterns. And while Lonergan applied himself to appropriating and articulating many of these patterns, most notably, of course, the intellectual pattern, but also the aesthetic, for example, it seems to me that a concentrated and sustained treatment of a mystical pattern or prayerful pattern of experience and its effects on the other patterns remains to be more fully developed. My question today then is, given that prayer and mysticism are basic possibilities of polymorphic human consciousness, that is, they are ways that human beings as conscious beings and as religiously converted can be, how can we best understand these possibilities in terms of the polymorphism of consciousness itself? And furthermore, how would a fuller understanding of these possibilities in terms of the polymorphism of consciousness contribute to a greater understanding of human consciousness as a unified whole? Today, I propose to take 3 small steps towards answering these admittedly rather broad questions. That said, I will not speak directly about a mystical pattern of experience as such. Rather, I will speak about what I, following Bernard McGinn, will call mystical consciousness. First, I will give an account of McGinn's proposal that Lonergan's notion of consciousness provides a rich basis for understanding mystical consciousness, a term that for McGinn signifies not only the mystic's experience of God in a profound moment of prayer, but also the transformation of consciousness that carries over from this kind of prayer into everyday living. Second, I will develop an understanding of McGinn's proposal through a discussion of the meaning of Lonergan's metaphor of levels of consciousness and their interrelations in terms of sublation. Third, and by way of conclusion, I will employ something like, though not exactly the same as, Mark Morelli's distinction between the operational and orientational polymorphism of consciousness to suggest that a robust account of mystical consciousness requires not only thinking of mystical consciousness in terms of operational polymorphism, that is in terms of levels of consciousness, which is more or less what McGinn suggests, but also it requires thinking of mystical consciousness in terms of orientational polymorphism, that is in terms of patterns of experience and their mutual influence upon each other. This latter task, which I will only gesture towards, is that of developing an account of a mystical or prayerful pattern of experience. And though I do not develop an understanding of that here, hopefully what I do here contributes to that. Lastly, as regards the conference topic throughout the paper, I will regularly suggest that mystical consciousness is a transformation of consciousness that affects the whole of human living, including, of course, decision-making. McGinn's proposal. In an article titled Mystical Consciousness, a Modest Proposal, Bernard McGinn begins with a reflection on the meaning of mysticism and spirituality. He understands spirituality as the broader term, quote, signifying the whole range of beliefs and practices by which the Christian church strives to live out its commitment to the spirit present in the risen Christ, end quote. Mysticism, the narrower term, signifies an integral element within spirituality. Mysticism, says McGinn, is, quote, the inner and hidden realization of spirituality through a transforming consciousness of God's immediate presence. Mysticism, or more precisely, the mystical element within Christian spirituality, is the goal to which spiritual practices aim, end quote. This transforming consciousness of God's immediate presence, which is sought through the cultivation of spiritual practice, is often called mystical experience. McGinn, however, dubs mystical experience a misleading interpretive category, due especially to the ambiguity of the word experience. Not only is the word experience one of the more ambiguous terms in Western thought, but it also, at least today, tends to refer to a discrete sense perception or feeling. That is, it tends to refer to a content or an act of consciousness at the empirical level rather than to consciousness itself. This meaning causes problems for speaking about mysticism, not because discrete sense perceptions and feelings are irrelevant to mystical texts or to mysticism generally, for that would not be true. Speaking about mystical experience is problematic, according to McGinn, because it restricts our understanding of God's intimate and immediate presence in mystical union to a discrete perceptual or affective experience within consciousness, thus foreclosing a possibility to which the tradition attests. This possibility is that God's intimate presence to the human being can be understood, at least also, if not primarily, as a transformation of consciousness itself as a whole, which somehow goes beyond any discrete content of consciousness. To overcome the pitfalls of the category of mystical experience, McGinn proposes that Lonergan's account of consciousness provides, quote, a more adequate theoretic basis for investigating mysticism, and also one that provides a better insight into the writings of the mystics themselves, end quote. More explicitly, his proposal is that a Lonerganian inspired understanding of, quote, mystical consciousness is a fruitful way to conceive of the forms of special encounter with God spoken of by Christian mystics, primarily because consciousness, as Lonergan understands it, emphasizes the entire process of human intentionality and self-presence, rather than just an originating pure feeling, sensation, or experience, easily separable from subsequent acts of thinking, loving, and deciding, end quote. To be clear, for Lonergan, consciousness does not mean explicit knowledge, nor does it mean simply focal awareness or what is brought to language. To be sure, knowing in the strict sense is conscious in Lonergan's sense. Bringing something into focal awareness through language or advertence is also conscious in his sense, but his meaning is broader still. For Lonergan, consciousness means the basic givenness of awareness, which is at once an awareness of the contents of consciousness, as well as of the subject as the performer of all cognitional and intentional activity, whether or not that performance is itself adverted to or thematized. As Lonergan says in Insight, quote, by consciousness, we shall mean that there is an awareness immanent in cognitional acts, end quote. Consciousness means then presence to oneself in and through presence to one's world, a presence immanent not only in sensing, imagining, and feeling, which are empirical acts, but also in any and all cognitional or intentional activity, including, of course, questioning, understanding, judging, deliberating, deciding, and as you know, the list goes on. As many of you will also know, Lonergan usually categorizes these acts according to levels, each of which precedes and sets the conditions for the emergence of the next. In Method and Theology, he names 4 levels: empirical, the intellectual, the rational, and the responsible. He also refers to these levels by the most conspicuous acts occurring on each level, calling them the levels of experiencing, understanding, judging, and deciding. With this in mind, note that when McGinn says that mystical consciousness transcends merely experiential consciousness, he is suggesting at least 2 things. First, he is suggesting that mystical consciousness of God's intimate and immediate presence is not reducible to the content of any act of consciousness, let alone to the content of an act of consciousness at the level of experiencing. Second, insofar as mystical consciousness is understood as pertaining to consciousness as such, it is not merely a transformation of consciousness immanent in empirical acts, rather it is a transformation of consciousness immanent in all acts, whether they are empirical, intellectual, rational, or responsible. Mystical consciousness then, and not just consciousness, is incipient in what McGinn calls religious consciousness, and by this he means what Lonergan might call consciousness as religiously converted, or, quote, being in love in an unrestricted fashion, end quote. Lonergan identifies religious conversion with the transformation of one's horizon by God's gift of God's love poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. In method, he says this gift of God's love flooding our hearts occurs at the fourth level of consciousness, that is, at the level of decision, and so interpersonal encounter, but he later indicates it may be a fifth level of its own. In either case, what is important about this is that such otherworldly and unrestricted being in love is, for Lonergan, not an act of consciousness, nor is it the content of any act of consciousness. Rather, it is the gift of an orientation towards transcendent mystery, which ultimately pertains to and reorients all conscious activity. Unrestricted being in love is, as Lonergan says, quote, a dynamic state that is prior to and principle of subsequent acts, end quote. In other words, being in love in an unrestricted fashion, or religious consciousness, as McGinn has called it, is a way of being towards transcendent mystery, which reorients all conscious activity. Mystical consciousness, McGinn argues, is not wholly distinct from this religious consciousness. It is rather something like a further differentiation, expansion, or development of religious consciousness. We might even say that it is a heightening of religious consciousness to which one disposes oneself in the cultivation of a life of prayer or spiritual exercise. McGinn identifies such mystical consciousness with what Thomas Merton calls meta-consciousness and describes it as the co-presence of God in one's own conscious activity. Mystical consciousness, McGinn says, is, quote, the co-presence of God in our inner acts, not as an object to be understood or grasped, but the transforming other who is, as Augustine put it, more intimate to us than we are to ourselves. In other words, in mystical consciousness, God is present not as an object, but as a goal that is both transcendent and yet immanent. He, she, is active in the human agent as the source or co-author of all our acts of experiencing, knowing, and loving. The infinite horizon of all knowing and loving somehow becomes really here in a new form of awareness in what mystics call ground, apex, or center of the soul, end quote. The point then is that mystical consciousness is somehow, at least, a deepening of religious conversion or religious consciousness understood as unrestricted being in love, which is not itself an act of consciousness or the content of any act. It is a transformation of consciousness immanent in all cognitional and intentional acts at all levels and can be understood as something like a co-consciousness in which one is aware that God is somehow the co-operator of one's conscious activity. To better understand what mystical consciousness as co-consciousness, co-presence, or co-operation could possibly mean, we have to better understand the meaning of the operative metaphor in Lonergan's account of consciousness, that of levels. The levels are usually distinguished in terms of the different acts that occur on the different levels. On this point, Patrick Byrne argues that for Lonergan, quote, the phrase level of consciousness refers primarily and directly to the subject as subject and only derivatively and indirectly to acts of consciousness, end quote. In other words, the spatial and hierarchical metaphor actually refers first and foremost to, quote, the manner or the mode of the subject's self-presence, end quote, when performing cognitional or intentional acts and not to the acts themselves. Empirical, intelligent, rational, and responsible consciousness all signify different ways that the subject can be present to self and to world, each of which has its own unique quality or texture, if you will. And I'm sure you all have the experience of the difference between just staring at a book because you're too tired to try to understand versus actually trying to understand it. You're present to yourself and to the world very differently. And that shift in quality, if I can use that term, is what mode of self-presence here signifies. So the spatial or hierarchical aspect of the metaphor then indicates that one must be conscious in a particular way or according to a particular mode as the condition of the possibility of eliciting certain kinds of acts of consciousness. One can sense or imagine without being intelligently, rationally, or responsibly conscious. One can merely run one's eyes over the lines of a book. One cannot understand, however, in the strict sense of having an insight without being intelligently conscious, without wondering, without being present to oneself and one's world wonderingly or intelligently. In other words, as Burns says, quote, while an act can occur on any appropriately high level of consciousness, there is a lowest level of consciousness below which it cannot occur, end quote. This understanding of the levels as different modes of self-presence that stand as the conditions of the possibility of eliciting different acts of consciousness brings us to the notion of sublation. Sublation for Lonergan refers to the way the levels of consciousness relate to each other. For example, Lonergan says the fourth level, quote, sublates the prior levels of experiencing, understanding, and judging. It goes beyond them, sets up a new principle and type of operations, directs them to a new goal, but so far from dwarfing them, preserves them, and brings them to a far fuller fruition, end quote. According to Professor Burns, sublation then primarily means not that acts of consciousness sublate each other, but that the subject as subject sublates itself by operating on a different level. That is, the subject present to self on a lower level is transformed or sublated by the subject present to self at a higher level. And if you have that experience of trying to read a book late at night and you can't get yourself to do it, and you try to get yourself to finally care about the book and understand it, I think that may be an experience of trying to move yourself into intellectual consciousness from empirical consciousness. But the point to stress is that, quote, sublation applies primarily to the subject as subject and only derivatively to acts of consciousness, end quote. This means that all acts on or below the fourth level can be responsible acts. It is in the same way all acts on or below the third level can be rational acts and so on. The lower level acts are taken up into a larger context by the subject who is now operating on a higher level, who is conscious in a more expansive way, and who therefore lives in a wider world. These lower level acts then are permeated by a quality or mode of self-presence proper to the higher level into which they are integrated. This way of thinking of levels in terms of sublation and of the saturation, as it were, of lower level acts of consciousness with the quality of consciousness proper to higher levels furthers our understanding of McGinn's proposal. Mystical consciousness can be understood as a deepening of religious consciousness. It can be characterized as either a transformation of fourth level consciousness or as a level of its own, that is the fifth level, which is experienced, for lack of a better word, not as the subject sublating itself, but as something like God, unifying God's self with the subject and sublating the subject in all of his or her conscious operations. Every conscious act can therefore be a religiously or mystically conscious act. When a subject is mystically conscious, a finite act of consciousness is somehow also conscious of the infinite. It is somehow a consciousness with God. Human consciousness in all of its various manifestations is lifted into an infinite context. It is saturated, as it were, with the infinite and loving presence of the divine. And I therefore suggest reading the with of being in love with God with the added significance of along with. That is, being in love with God in an unrestricted fashion can also become being in love along with God in an unrestricted fashion. It is a lived conscious identity with infinite loving understanding, which permeates all of consciousness and which calls one forth to ever further self-transcendence. To move towards a conclusion then, I wish to offer a brief summary of the road traveled so far and then to raise a question. By way of summary, McGinn proposes that to the extent that the word experience refers to sense perception or feelings alone or to conscious operations at the first level of consciousness, and not to the entirety of consciousness at all levels, it is a misleading category for understanding mystical testimony. It reduces the experience of God to some discrete content of consciousness, an assumption that cannot account for mystical witness that contends that God's intimate presence subsumes and flows through all conscious activities, empirical or otherwise, within and beyond an explicitly prayerful context. Lonergan's notion of consciousness offers a different approach because it accounts for the entire process of human consciousness. Mystical consciousness then can be understood as the dynamic state of being in love, deepened through spiritual practice so as to become something like a co-consciousness with God, which sublates, though sublation is perhaps being used analogously here, and therefore permeates all lower levels of conscious operation. What I want to point out in question, however, is that this account of mystical consciousness, as I've begun to talk about it in development, is primarily construed in terms of something like what Mark Morelli has called operational polymorphism, which means that the polymorphism of human consciousness is understood primarily in terms of levels. And I am aware that I'm not using this term in exactly the same way Professor Morelli uses it, since he uses it to talk about the first three levels in the context of philosophical dialectics. But my point remains the same. Here, polymorphism, the polymorphism of consciousness, mystical consciousness, it's all understood primarily in terms of levels and sublation, and that is a bit of an abstraction. And so my question is, how does this relate to patterns of experience? Again, patterns of experience are more or less the different ways the dominant concerns of one's horizon can yield the selective attention, which orients and patterns not only the subject's empirical experience, but the subject as such, including all of his or her conscious operations. And I want to suggest that in order to develop a more robust account of mysticism and mystical consciousness, we need also to develop an understanding of mystical, prayerful, or worshipful consciousness in terms of the orientational polymorphism of consciousness, that is, in terms of patterns of experience. The account presented above does not speak about mystical consciousness in this way. It does, however, suggest that mystical consciousness, at least in part, is the fruit of spiritual practice, the significance of which flows over into the rest of one's living. But I believe that this spiritual practice is, at least in part, the cultivation of a pattern of experience. In other words, the account I've presented tries to explain how mystical union with God can be operative while one is not in a mystical or explicitly prayerful patterning of experience. It does not, however, give an account of the way the flow of consciousness would be patterned in prayer when one's dominant interest is explicitly and centrally worshipful openness to the ultimate, all, God. It seems to me that a more concrete and complete account of mystical consciousness and the way this kind of consciousness affects the rest of human living in all times and all places, and very importantly, decision-making, would have to do precisely this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was great. Does anybody have, we have a few minutes for questions here. Anybody have any questions for John? Raise your hand or, yeah. Dr. Byrne, Pat, you have a question? Go ahead.
Oh, we can't hear you.
I haven't mastered the electronic hand raising. So just a bit of a response to, first of all, I love the metaphor of staring at a book and not understand as a way of illustrating that. I thought that was a great example. In terms of the last question that you posed, the way I understand the distinction between levels of consciousness and Mark's recent article on this is really a very important one, and patterns of experience. I think it's chapter 17 of Insight, where Lonergan briefly mentions the mystical pattern of experience. It's sort of like bing goes by. If you blink your eyes, you miss it. It has to do with that everything else seems to drop out of one's experiencing in that pattern. So some of the images that the mystics like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila use about the darkness, that one's experience is completely absorbed. You could say that that's the mystical pattern of experience, but I like your comment about the fifth level of consciousness being present in what one thinks and one does. So there certainly are people, and certainly Ignatius is one very vivid example, though there's quite literally thousands of other examples where they're performing both their thinking, their writing, their administrating, their teaching out of that horizon of the fifth level. They really are present to themselves as being in love with God as they do all those things. And so you might say that's a key distinction. You can think of the mystical pattern of experience as a certain kind of specialization on that experiencing to the exclusion of all others, as opposed to the way in which operating on the fifth level of consciousness is organizing one's other activities and one's other experiences in the horizon of being in love in an unrestricted fashion.
Thank you very much. Yeah, one question I also have about that is, it seems like certain types of spiritual practice, contemplative practice, some types of Christian mindfulness are are not yet themselves this, going into a cloud of unknowing, being drawn into that, but a certain way of learning to cultivate a certain attitude towards your own acts of consciousness as they can't but keep happening. And so I wonder too if there's a way of talking about a prayerful or contemplative process of patterning or detachment or something like that that could be sort of helpful for thinking about contemplative practice.
Thank you. Liam, you had your hand up. Are you still interested in asking a question?
Yeah, it wasn't the question I raised my hand just for what Johnny just said. Actually, I was just going to offer that John Leclerc's book, The Love of Learning and the Desire for God, might be helpful because he kind of talks about the monastic practice of combining sort of a classical theological liberal education with the practice of contemplative prayer.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'll look into it.
Can I ask a question, Steve?
Yep, go ahead, Ben.
John, and maybe Pat as well, or whoever wants to weigh in. When I've thought about mystical pattern of experience in the past, I have not always thought about the cloud of unknowing or sort of the blotting out of so much else in the pattern of experience as being part of that. The image that I frequently have, or the example I frequently think of, and this may be totally wrong, but I just am curious, is I know people who regularly talk about seeing angels. So I know a woman who went to she took some time away and went and stayed in a cabin in the woods on a camping trip, and she said that she saw angels hovering over this other woman's cabin. And she went and talked to this woman, and it turned out that this woman had come out to the woods to kill herself. And so when this sort of friend of mine talked to this woman, she then was able to say, well, okay, let's go back to the city, let's get some help. So it was bizarre. I have no experience of having seen angels or having had visions like that in my own life. But the woman who talks like this regularly of seeing angels and things is not a crazy person. You know what I mean? And the fruit of whatever she's seeing seems regularly to cash out in her noticing other people's pain, other people's challenges, and moving her to address them in concrete ways. And so I look at it and I say, well, is this just a linguistic difference? Is it a difference in pattern of experience? Is what she's calling seeing angels what I would call, well, I just had a gut feeling, or is she actually noticing things that I'm not? Is that the sort of thing that, in your understanding, might fit into the mystical pattern of experience, or am I misapplying that here? Or I don't know, just a curiosity. Thanks.
I have not even thought about seeing angels or anything like that when working through this, so I don't really have an answer. But maybe, did you address this both to me and to Professor Byrne? Because I'm not sure I can answer it.
All comers.
All comers, yeah. Anyone want to help me out with that one?
Well, I was just going to jump in and kind of add to that question. I think I've been reading through a lot of Bulgakov's understanding of religious consciousness, particularly with regard to mysticism. And I mean, granted, he's positioning himself in a quite strong polemic against Hegel, so I don't want to lay any sort of Hegelian charges against Lonergan, but I just wonder about the language of saying co-consciousness with God, and if that sort of dialectical framework for talking about this sort of pattern of sublation still remains too much at the level of discourse or discursivity, in a way that even though the goal is not to make God an object of an act of consciousness, still might do so. So I guess maybe I'm also interested in the more general connection between method and what Lonergan's doing there, and how that would relate to the sort of interruption or the madness. Or Bulgakov has this very striking image of, God can talk through Elam's ass, or women can see angels, like that there are these things which are not necessarily subject to discursivity. And then, of course, that has implications for how he understands sort of apophasis, meon versus ugon distinctions with the absolute. But I don't know if that's an entirely clear question, but I guess I'm just trying to work out what exactly the place of discursivity is for this discussion of consciousness, and whether or not it sort of falls into the trap that Lonergan seems to be trying to avoid, or at least how you presented it.
So I have two things to mention. One is that Professor Byrne, helpfully in one of his articles, points out that Lonergan by sublation doesn't exactly mean the same thing Hegel does. And he does say that. And if you think of Hegel speaking of sublation in terms of concepts, and the sublation negating certain elements of the other concept while integrating it into a further concept, in a certain sense that would remain at the level of discursivity, as you've said, because it's a conceptual sublation. But this use of sublation is less, it's pre-conceptual. It's you operate, I don't know exactly how to say it, you become moving into a wider world, you becoming more fully yourself. And when you're, and that sort of mode of self-presence I described, when you are like not understanding the book, then you try to understand it, or you're laying on the beach in the sun and it's really warm out. And then I think this is an example in, I forget whose book it is, but then someone screams in the water and you like get up to like go see what's going on. Sort of the quality of your consciousness has changed, and you've moved from just like baking in the sun to feeling like you need to go maybe attend to something and help somebody. And that sort of is you, like that's you sublating yourself. That's you bringing yourself into this wider world of responsibility. And that's not a concept sublating a concept. You know what I mean? So that's one way of talking about sublation that would get maybe out of this issue with discursivity, if that begins to ask your question. I'm not sure what that has to do with seeing angels or how to connect it, but hopefully that helps.
Cool. Thank you, John, and thank you for the great questions. I'm going to move us along here, though, to keep us on schedule.